it turns out, yeah, we do. We do see the right hemisphere showing more activation in signers than people who only have an oral language. But it's not just that the brains of signers respond to gestures differently. Non-signers and signers alike, when they see someone moving their hands and it's not language, their brains do the same thing. It's not that they somehow interpret gesture in a different way. If they see something that their brain knows is language, it responds to it like it's language. If they see something that their brain doesn't recognize as language, just like you wouldn't if someone were doing gestures and you couldn't understand them, then their brains do exactly the same thing. So they are sensitive to gestures as language and distinguish those from gestures that are not language. Their right hemisphere does show more activation when they're processing signs, though. So we do see, I mean, there is spatial processing involved in the processing of signs. You have to store a lot of information about where people are making particular signs because that's part of the information that they're giving you as they speak. So they do have some increased right hemisphere activation. As I mentioned before, damage. We see that brain damage in the left and right hemisphere affects deaf people the same way it affects hearing people when it comes to language. So it's not that they're processing all of their language in the right hemisphere. They're definitely engaging the same left hemisphere areas for language processing that you and I are engaging right now. And it's interesting that someone who is deaf can experience brain damage in such a way that it impairs their ability to talk, but not their ability to do other things with their hands. So clearly there's two separate control systems that are making them gesture for other things. Like, just waving at somebody is one kind of gesture, but actually signing is a different one. There's different systems controlling those two things. So language gestures and other manual gestures are being controlled by different processes in the brains of signers. Their brains are treating language as special. And so they can lose their language gesturing ability or their non-linguistic gesturing ability independently, which is, you would think that if you lose the ability to do things with your hands, you would just lose everything. But even if they lose control of non-linguistic gestures, they have a hard time with motor control. When they want to try and talk, they regain some of that control. It's very unusual. Now, I mentioned a little bit ago about reading. And a lot of people think, well, it's okay if you can't talk orally, you can read. I mean, how often if you turn on the TV and you see the captioning at the bottom, right? You're like, oh, that's closed captioning for the hearing impaired. That's great. That gives them access to everything that's on the TV. Well, one of my good friends in grad school, she did her doctorate on American Sign Language, the psycholinguistics of American Sign Language, and she studied how much signers, people who speak American Sign Language, really understand about what's coming across the bottom of the screen in closed captioning. And her research showed that deaf people who were trying to read in real time about what was going across the bottom of the screen were only getting about 40 to 50% of the information. So it's because, again, they're reading, the words that are coming across the bottom of the screen are coming across in the order that they're being spoken, and they're being spoken in English. And English has a different syntax. So it would be like having to read closed captioning when all the words are in the wrong order for you and trying to keep up. And that's why it's not the same to have closed captioning for the hearing impaired as it is to have an interpreter there signing for the person, because the interpreter is signing in the word order that's easier for the person to understand, which is why people like the mayor of New York City don't just rely on closed captioning, because their deaf citizens might miss critical information. When deaf individuals are trying to learn how to read, they really struggle. Most adults, well, I can really say this, that at least 50% of ASL using adults read at about a third grade level or less for English. They don't, it's very difficult for them about reading. When you learn how to read, what's one thing people always tell you? Well, sound out the words. It doesn't help very much if you have no idea what sounds like, right? Or you don't know what any of those things sound like. You might be able to feel them in your mouth, but it doesn't mean anything to you. So you tell people to sound them out, or hooked on phonics, help me learn how to read, right? There is no phonics when you're deaf, right? You can't make those connections. So because they don't have that phonemic awareness, because phonemes, sound-based phonemes aren't meaningful to them, learning how to read is really, really difficult. Yeah?
So why don't they have, like, a English? Like, I'm saying, like, I know it's in French, but why don't they make one for American Sign Language?
Okay, because it's their language.
You know.
I know, I mean, thinking it's a similar argument to, why when people speak a different language, don't they, and they come to a country where there's a different language spoken, why don't they always just immediately learn the language of the country that they're in?
Well, I'm just saying, like, they're signing in English.
Some.
Okay,
To some degree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
A little bit. I mean, the spelling is right, but imagine learning how to spell if you didn't know what any of the letters sounded like. Actually, in English it wouldn't matter because you can never tell how something, as you know, well known now, doesn't make any difference. Question?
This is from Natural Born Science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very difficult for them to do. And if we look at what's happening in their brains while they're reading English words, because again, talking about a median have a performance in third grade, that means that 50% have a performance at third grade or less, and 50% have a performance at third grade or higher, right? And there are, of course, deaf people who are quite literate in reading English. They, go to college and they get PhDs and they're professors and they're artists and they do all kinds of things. And they're brilliant people who can read quite well, but it's not typical. When we look at the brains of people who are native deaf signers, and we look at them reading English, we see that their right hemisphere is doing a lot more work when reading than someone who is hearing would do. So their right hemisphere is not, it's doing work that people who are reading their native language don't do. So their right hemisphere is trying to process these images as something else besides language. They do respond to meaning in a similar way. So N400 is a brainwave response that is evoked in response to things not making sense. So we see that particular waveform gets really big when you read something that doesn't make any sense. And they are able to understand when the meaning, even if they're looking at a sentence and the word order is strange, they're able to pretty much extract meaning in a normal way. And if you throw a weird word in there that they can't integrate, they'll get this response just like you and I would. But their brain doesn't respond to some words in English the way hearing people do. Closed class words, these are words that you can't add new members into the category. So we don't typically add new prepositions. We don't typically add new conjunctions. We don't typically add new determiners. These are all closed class words. And when you and I experience words like that, our brain has a particular response when we see a word that comes from one of those classes, but their brain doesn't do that. So they're not processing those connector words in the same way that someone who is hearing processes them. Because what they're focusing on the most, trying to extract meaning from the stuff, is those content words, right? Just like little kids do when they're trying to figure out what people are saying or when they're trying to produce utterances of their own. They don't worry about and the and in and on and or. They focus on nouns and verbs and adjectives, and that's what these people are focusing on. So in a way, it's like their brain isn't even processing those other words because they're not useful to them for extracting meaning from the sentence. And since those markers, things like in and on and the and stuff like that, are typically used to help structure the syntax of a sentence, and because the signers are reading in a word order that doesn't make any sense to them anyway. Paying attention to those words is not useful to them because they don't know the syntax, so those things aren't good cues for them, so they just ignore them. And their brains don't respond to them. Now you might think that people who are deaf and who grow up using sign language, their brains might process visual information a little bit differently because maybe they're a bit more sensitive. And it's true that if someone is born deaf and they spend their life interacting with people using sign language, that part of their brain that would have been used for processing sound can be co-opted by the visual processing system. So their temporal lobes start processing visual information, not auditory information, because they don't need it to process auditory information. So the brain says, hey, if you don't need this, if you're not going to use this stuff for listening, can I use it for seeing? So, and so you might think, all right, given that that's true, do deaf people see better since they have more brain real estate dedicated to processing visual information? Do they see better than people who are hearing? And the answer is not really. They don't see better. But what the additional processing power gives them that hearing people don't typically have is an ability to distribute their visual attention more effectively. They can process more of a visual scene faster than you or I can, because they're able to pay attention more broadly to what's happening in their visual world because they're not distracted by sounds. And all of that information is useful to them. And what this looks like when you see someone doing it is it seems like, wow, they just see really well, like their vision is heightened compared to somebody who's not deaf. And it's not really heightened. I mean, they see in the same range of light and everything that we do. It really seems to be about their ability to distribute their attention. They can see things out here much more effectively than you and I can. They process stuff in the periphery and motion in the periphery much better, much faster. And that's kind of a survival skill, right? You can't hear somebody coming up behind you, so it's not until they get into your range of vision that you even know they're there. So you need to be really sensitive to what's going on around you, even in the periphery. You and I, as hearing people, will rely on hearing someone, hearing the bike coming up the path, or hearing footsteps on the walk. Someone who's deaf can't do that. So they become much more sensitive to picking up tiny movements out in the periphery than we are, which makes it seem like their vision is better. And it's not that their vision is better, it's just that they're more sensitive because they need to be more sensitive. People who are native signers process visual motion more in the left hemisphere than people who are non-native signers or people who don't sign. So they're actually processing movement more across both parts of their brain than people who are not signers. And it doesn't matter whether they're hearing or deaf. Something about learning how to sign encourages your brain to process motion in a more distributed way. People who are born deaf, people who are congenitally deaf, as I said, will organize, their brains will organize differently than the brains of people who can hear ever. Okay, so if you're born deaf and you never hear a sound, you didn't hear sounds when you were in the womb, you've never heard a sound since you were born, because your brain just doesn't take in sound information. Those parts of the brain that are normally dedicated to that function will almost always be rededicated to processing visual information and tactile information, because you need these things to be more sensitive for your survival. As a result of acquiring sign language and having this different sensitivity to space and motion and the being able to attend in more detail to your visual world, signers are able to do spatial processing tasks in a slightly different way, sometimes a more effective way, than people who are non-signers. They're better at mentally rotating things. They can do it much faster than people who are not signers. And part of that is because when people sign, they sign from their own perspective. So when I talk and I go like this, I'm talking about me. In your head, you have to think about, when I do this, you have to translate that into you, right? It's a different spatial thing. And when I sign, I talk about what I saw from my perspective. And as you're looking at me, talking with me, you have to mentally put yourself into my perspective and imagine what I saw in order to understand that, understand what I'm doing, and understand the signs that I'm making. And so that because their language requires perpetual mental rotation of the world, they're actually better at mentally rotating objects in their mind all the time, for everything, even if it's not about language and signing. They're better at telling about the relationships between things, so you can show them pictures of objects and say, is this a mirror image of this or not? Is this an exact duplicate of this or not? What's missing here? What's different about these two images? They can process that stuff a lot faster than people who don't sign. They're also better at putting themselves in taking the perspective of others, the physical perspective of others. So it's easier and faster for signers to imagine what someone else can see, even if they can't see it. They're able to put themselves in another person's shoes and physically see the world the way, imagine what the person is seeing through their own eyes, even if that's different than what they themselves are seeing. And that's referred to as theory of mind, being able to literally put yourself in someone else's physical position in your mind and imagine what would be visible to them in the world. Signers are much better at that than people who don't sign, because they have to do it all the time as part of their language processing. All right. I mentioned before that one treatment for deafness is the use of something called a cochlear implant. Now, a cochlear implant is a device that can be hooked up to the auditory nerve that will allow sound to come in, because for some reason the ear is not taking in the sound, but the auditory nerve must be intact. So if the reason the person can't hear is because their auditory nerves aren't developed properly, or they were damaged, or something like that, then a cochlear implant won't work. It's not, because it has to be able to connect into the auditory nerve. They also have to have auditory cortex that's still available for processing sound. So you can't, if you say you know somebody who's 25 years old and they've been deaf their whole life, it may be that their auditory, and they've never had an implant put in, it may be that their auditory nerve is intact, but by age 25, they don't have auditory cortex that's available for processing sound anymore, because it's been rededicated. Their brain doesn't hear, and the brain is using it now for other stuff. It's not going to waste all that neural real estate. It's not going to save it in case hearing happens at some point. Your brain is changing at an incredible rate when you're little. And so if you're going to put a cochlear implant in a deaf person, it needs to happen when they're really, really little. When it does, really super cute videos of little kids hearing their parents' voices for the first time because cochlear implants are put in, but it really needs to happen very, very early. If you wait too long, then the child's brain will be rededicating those resources, and the cochlear implant won't have anything to send information to that can process the details it's sending. Now, I had a student who went deaf. She could hear when she was little. She was about, I think, 7 or 8 years old, but her hearing got worse and worse through her life, and by the time she was in elementary school, she was deaf. And so she could hear early on, and her parents did opt to have a cochlear implant put in, and she says, now if her cochlear implant is on, she can She hears, but it doesn't sound like what she remembers sound was exactly like. She says it sounds a little bit, it sounds kind of still fuzzy, and it doesn't have the same depth that she remembers sound having when she was a kid. Of course, she's remembering this now. She graduated 2 years ago from Georgia State, and so she's been through college and all that. But she went through college with interpreters, and she speaks fluent Farsi, because that's her first language, and English and American Sign Language. But she's really interesting to talk to because she's one of the few people I know who can tell you what it sounds like with the cochlear implant on or off. And she says, yeah, sometimes when people are talking and I just get sick of listening to them because people talk all the time and they never shut up. She says, I just go turn it off and then it's quiet. It's like the whole world is a library. It's wonderful. Because she says when she turns off her cochlear implant, there's nothing. She can hear zero. When she turns it on, she's getting information and she can hear pretty well. She also reads lips. So she actually worked in the Georgia State bookstore for a while, and now she's a Montessori teacher. And she does all that because she's still very oral. She can speak quite a bit, but you do have to look at her directly when you talk to her so she can see what you're saying because she's doing a lot of lip reading.
How big is the implant?
The cochlear implant?
Yeah, is it straight in your ear? Okay.
Yeah, it's not in your ear. It's not a hearing aid. It's actually implanted. There's a thing that goes in your skull. So it'll be placed up here, about here. So she wears hers, she has the hair shaped out around it, but she has long hair, so you can never see that she has her implant. Yeah. So you don't, but if you take a look at some of those videos, you'll see there's a white disc here, and that's because they've actually put something in the implant. I mean, it's an implant. It's in through your skull, into your brain. And even with, if someone has some auditory function, it takes a while after the cochlear implant has been put in for the person to learn how to process that information. If their brain hasn't been listening to sound, it hasn't learned how to hear things. And we take for granted that little babies are discovering the world for the first time, but it's odd if you see an older baby or a child that's 1 or 2 or 3 years old who doesn't seem to understand what's going on with sound, because you can't imagine that they don't know what sound is about. But if they've never heard anything, it takes a few months for them to start to take in that information, organize it, and categorize it. So even if a child were 2 or 3 or 4 years old and had been signing, if you put that implant in, it's going to take them a while to be able to even process that sound information as language, because language has not been sound-based for them before. So it takes a while for them to figure it out. On the PowerPoint, I linked a bunch of interesting resources. If you're interested in sign language, you want to learn more about it, you'd like to learn about training to be a sign language interpreter, or you just want to learn some basic signs because maybe you know somebody who's deaf and you'd like to be able to communicate with them, or if you'd like to learn more about deaf culture, which is a whole separate culture in and of itself with music and art and poetry and all kinds of things that are all integrated in with signing. You can take a look at these links. I'm not going to put you through all of them. But I just put them up there because they're good resources and they're ones that my former deaf student said she thought they were pretty cool. And there's also some interesting, this particular one I really like, What's It Like to Be Deaf, is a story told by a young African-American man who was deaf and grew up in a hearing family, and he talked about how really challenging it was because his parents kind of didn't get it. His parents didn't, they were like, okay, so you're deaf. That's it, but they wouldn't let him have the TV with closed captioning and stuff like that because they're like, well, that's just going to encourage you. Like, but I can't hear. So he talked about what it was like to be a deaf kid growing up in a hearing family and how that was really challenging and how exciting it was for him when he first got to go to a school where everybody was deaf, and all of a sudden it was like, he says, the whole world opened up because everybody got it. And he's like, there's just some things hearing people don't get. If you're not deaf, you don't get it. So there's some great videos up there. So now I have a question for you before we run off because now class is over. Would you like to have the quiz on Friday and not have class on Monday? Or would you like to have the quiz on Monday